I poured $450,000 into my husband's restaurant, and he didn't even save me a seat at the opening. That's the sentence I keep coming back to. Not the divorce papers. Not the moment I found out about her. Not even the night I changed every lock and froze every account. Just that one simple fact. I gave him everything, and he didn't think I was worth an invitation. Let me back up. When I met my husband, I was 26 and working as a senior financial analyst at a consulting firm downtown. He was 31, charming, in that effortless way that makes you feel like the most interesting person in the room whenever he looked at you. He had this dream. He'd had it since culinary school, he said, to open a fine dining restaurant. Not a chain, not a franchise, something with his name on it, something that meant something. I believed in him. I want to be clear about that, because everything that came after doesn't change what I felt then. I genuinely believed in him. We dated for 2 years, got married quietly at the courthouse with his sister and my college roommate as witnesses, and moved into the condo I'd bought at 24. Within 6 months of the wedding, he'd quit his head chef position at the hotel where he'd worked for 5 years. The plan, we agreed, was that I'd support us while he developed the restaurant concept. I had the income for it. I was good at what I did. It didn't feel like a sacrifice. It felt like a partnership. The restaurant took 3 years to build from the ground up. 3 years of permits and contractors and design consultations and supplier negotiations. 3 years of me reviewing spreadsheets at the kitchen table after 10-hour workdays, helping him understand cash flow projections and break-even analyses. 3 years of my paycheck going into what we called the project fund. By the time the build-out was done, I had personally contributed $450,000, not counting the condo we lived in, which I'd owned before we married, and which he'd quietly begun referring to as our lease, in a way that always sat slightly wrong with me, but that I never pushed back on. My mother-in-law had contributed nothing. I want to be clear about that too. She'd offered opinions constantly, the tile choice in the dining room, the name, the logo, the menu philosophy, but when it came to the actual capital that kept the project alive, it was my earnings, my savings, my rent account I'd partially liquidated with a tax penalty I paid out of pocket. She knew this. Everyone knew this. The restaurant was called Aldine, named after a neighborhood in the city where my husband had grown up before his family moved to the suburbs when he was 12. It was beautiful. I'd helped choose the lighting. The soft opening was scheduled for a Thursday evening in November. It was meant to be small. Maybe 40 people, a test run for the kitchen and front-of-house staff before the official public launch 2 weeks later. I'd known about it for months. I'd asked my husband twice in the weeks leading up to it whether I needed to dress up, whether he wanted me to greet guests at the door, whether he'd prefer I stay in the background so the spotlight stayed on him. I was trying to be thoughtful. He said he'd handle the guest list. I came home that Thursday evening around 7:30 after a long day. A client presentation had run late, and I'd texted him to let him know. The condo was quiet. He wasn't home. I figured he was already at Aldine, in the middle of service, too busy to check his phone. I changed out of my work clothes and drove over. The host at the door, a young woman I'd met twice during the build-out, looked at me with an expression I can only describe as careful. She checked her list, twice. Then she said, quietly and with what I think was genuine discomfort, that my name wasn't on it. I thought there had been a mistake. I told her I was his wife. She nodded and said she knew, and that she was sorry, and asked if I wanted her to get someone. My husband came to the door 3 minutes later. He was in a jacket I hadn't seen before, something tailored and dark. He looked good. He looked like a man at the beginning of something. He stepped outside with me onto the sidewalk and said, in a tone so measured it felt rehearsed, that the soft opening was just for close family and a few industry contacts. He said it was a small list. He said my mother-in-law was inside and his sister, and a couple of the investors he'd brought in. I hadn't known about the investors, and that it was just easier this way, for the night to be contained. I stood there on that sidewalk in the cold and said, "I'm your wife," he said. "I know, I'll explain everything later. Tonight just isn't the right time." I drove home. I didn't cry, which surprised me. I sat in the kitchen of the condo I'd bought at 24, and I thought very clearly that something had shifted in a way I hadn't been paying close enough attention to. He came home after 2 in the morning, smelling like wine and kitchen smoke, and told me it had gone beautifully. He said the lamb dish had gotten a standing ovation. He said his mother had cried. He did not apologize for what had happened at the door, and I did not bring it up because I was still processing what exactly had happened at the door. The next morning, I went to work and pulled up the shared financial accounts on my lunch break. I'd had full visibility into these accounts for 3 years. We'd set them up together. My access had been changed. Not revoked entirely, I could still see the balances, but I'd been moved from joint account holder to read only. The change had been made 4 days earlier. I sat at my desk and stared at that screen for a long time. I didn't confront him that night. I went home, made dinner, asked him how the debrief with the kitchen staff had gone. He talked for an hour about the menu adjustments he wanted to make before the official opening. I listened and nodded and refilled his water glass and thought about what I knew and what I didn't know, and what I was going to do about it. There were investors I hadn't known about. There was a restructured account access I hadn't agreed to. There had been a conversation happening about the restaurant's ownership and financing that I had not been part of. I called my attorney the next morning from my car, parked 2 blocks from our building. My attorney had done my property purchase at 24 and my general estate planning 2 years before the wedding. She was careful and direct and didn't use more words than she needed to. I told her what I'd observed. She told me to gather everything I could and to do it quietly. I spent the next 10 days moving carefully. I pulled together every financial record from the project fund, every transfer, every invoice, every receipt I'd signed off on. I located the original loan documentation I'd signed as a personal guarantor on one of the construction loans, documentation that had my husband's signature, and also, on one page, a signature that was meant to be mine but that I had not written and did not recognize. My attorney said that was significant. She said it carefully, the way lawyers say things that are going to change the shape of your life. I also found, during that same 10-day period, a text thread on my husband's phone while he was in the shower. I wasn't looking for it. The phone was on the counter and a message came in, and I glanced at it, and the name at the top and the first line of the message were enough to understand everything about the last several months that I hadn't been able to piece together. Her name was someone I'd met once, briefly, at an industry event he'd taken me to about a year earlier. She was a pastry consultant. I remembered thinking she was pretty. I remembered my husband introducing me to her and moving on quickly. I didn't tell him what I'd found. I went back to the kitchen and finished making coffee and handed him a cup when he came out of the bathroom and said good morning. The official public opening of Aldine was 10 days away. I had been planning in the weeks before the soft opening to attend in the role I'd quietly occupied for 3 years. A supportive in the background, invisible hand behind the finances, someone who smiled and said, "He's the talent," whenever anyone asked. 7 days before the opening, my Savid in the early afternoon while I was in a meeting. Stepped out to take it. He said there were outstanding invoices, a beverage supplier and a linen service that totaled just under $18,000. He said the operating account was thin. He said, could I transfer what was needed from my personal account? I said calmly that my personal account was for close family. There was silence on the line. He said, "What does that mean?" I said, "It means what I said." He said my name the way he said it when he was starting to get frustrated but trying not to show it. He said we'd talk about this when I got home. I said fine and went back into my meeting. That evening, I told him I'd been to see my attorney. I told him I knew about the account restructuring. I told him I knew about the forged signature on the guarantor document. I said that last part quietly and watched his face do something I had never seen it do before. He said it wasn't what I thought. He said he'd done it because the timeline was tight and he hadn't been able to reach me and he'd needed to move quickly. He said he was going to fix it. He said I was making this into something it wasn't. I said, I'm not making it into anything. I'm just telling you what I know. His mother called me the following morning. I don't know what he told her the night before, But her tone when I picked up was the tone she used when she believed she was straightening something out, brisk and slightly impatient, as if I were a misunderstanding she was correcting rather than a person she was speaking to. She said that whatever friction there was between me and my husband needed to be set aside until after the opening. She said this was his moment. She said she hoped I could rise to that. I said, "You're right that it's an important time. I hope everything goes smoothly." She took that as an agreement and hung up. What she didn't know, what neither of them knew yet, was that I had spent the previous week quietly confirming something I'd noticed during the financial review. The building that housed Aldine was leased. The lease was a 10-year commercial agreement. The guarantor on the lease was the Project Fund LLC that we had set up together at the beginning of the build-out. I had restructured my ownership stake in that LLC during the 10 days of quiet documentation. My attorney had advised it. The structure was legitimate and it was clean, and it was done before anyone had thought to move me to read only on anything that actually mattered. I also called the personal guarantee on the construction loan, the one with the signature that wasn't mine, and reported the discrepancy to the lender. Quietly, factually, with documentation. The morning of the public opening, I got up early and made coffee and sat in the kitchen of the condo I had bought at 24, which was titled in my name and had always been titled in my name, and I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Not anger, exactly. More like clarity, the particular clearness that comes when you stop trying to hold something together that was never held together to begin with. My husband came downstairs in his good jacket and said he was heading to the restaurant early. I said, "Good luck tonight." He looked at me. There was something in his face, uncertainty, or maybe the beginning of understanding, but he left without saying anything else. I did not go to the opening. My attorney called me at 9:30 that evening. The lender had been in contact with my husband's attorney. The LLC restructuring had been noticed. There were questions about the lease guarantor position. My husband called me 11 times between 9:45 and 10:30. I answered on the 11th call. He was outside the restaurant. I could hear noise behind him, kitchen sounds, voices, a night in service. He said my name in a way I hadn't heard before. Not the frustrated version, something stripped of the performance. He said, "What did you do?" I said, "I protected what's mine, the way you should have done for me." He said this was going to destroy everything he'd built. I said, "You didn't build it alone." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I know." That was the most honest thing he'd said to me in a year. I filed for divorce the following week. My attorney was efficient and thorough. The forged signature became part of the proceedings in a way that resolved several financial questions quickly and in my favor. The LLC structure held. The condo remained mine, as it had always been mine. His mother left me a voicemail 2 weeks after I filed. She said I was being vindictive. She said I was punishing her son for a misunderstanding. She said I would regret this when I was older, and understood what it meant to support someone you love. I saved the voicemail. I listened to it twice. And then I thought about standing on that sidewalk in November in the cold, being told I wasn't on the list for an opening I had financed, and I thought about the version of myself that had driven home that night without crying because I was too stunned to cry. I thought about 3 years of spreadsheets and tax penalties and project fund transfers and signing my name to documents because I trusted someone enough to build something with him. I did not call her back. The divorce was finalized in the spring. Aldine closed 8 months after it opened. The combination of the lender dispute and a restructured lease agreement made the operating math very difficult, which my former husband's attorney made clear to my attorney in language that was meant to sound like an accusation but read like a confession. I didn't take any satisfaction in the closure, not really. I'd wanted the restaurant to succeed. I'd wanted all of it to be what I'd thought it was going to be. But it wasn't, and once you see that clearly, there's nothing left to protect except yourself. I'm 31 now. I still have the condo. I got a promotion at the firm in February, with a title change, and the kind of number on the offer letter that made me sit in my car in the parking garage and just breathe for a minute. My college roommate came to visit last month, and we opened a bottle of wine, and she asked me if I was okay, really okay, not just functioning okay. I thought about it for a long time before I answered. I told her I was better than okay. I told her I finally knew the difference between loving someone and funding them, and that knowing the difference had cost me a lot, but it had cost me less than not knowing would have. She said that was the most expensive lesson she'd ever heard of. I laughed and said, "Yeah, probably, but I learned it, and that's the part I'm keeping."